The ceasefire in Gaza is supposed to begin just hours from now, but things are taking an unexpected turn. NBC News is reporting that Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, is considering a visit to Gaza. No one from the Biden administration has visited Gaza, well, in years. News of Witkoff's potential visit comes after a series of confusing messages today. Earlier tonight, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a video message, and he made it clear this ceasefire is only temporary. He said Israel reserves the right to resume attacks on Gaza and that, in fact, they have the support of the United States. He also mentioned a call with President-elect Trump. And according to Netanyahu, Trump confirmed that the ceasefire is meant to be temporary. Now, at the same time, far-right Israeli ministers are speaking out. They are pushing for the war to continue and even calling on Israel for a takeover of the Gaza Strip. And then there's Trump earlier today. He told NBC News that the ceasefire, quote, better hold. But in the same breath, he said that he told Netanyahu to keep doing what you have to do. The first phase of the ceasefire calls for a pause in fighting, the release of dozens of hostages, and the release of Palestinian prisoners. I spoke with Amir Tibon, a senior columnist at Haaretz, about the ceasefire and the hostages. Take a listen. Amir, thank you so much for joining us. Let's start with the statement that was put out today by the Israeli Prime Minister in that video. He said that during his phone call with President-elect Trump, Trump emphasized that this was a temporary ceasefire. You also had the finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, also saying that Netanyahu had committed to him to a gradual takeover of Gaza and keeping it uninhabitable. We've seen the prime minister take the potential ceasefire deals repeatedly by tanking them. How do statements like these impact the ceasefire deal that's supposed to start in a few hours?
So what we're seeing is Netanyahu putting out contradictory messaging to his own coalition partners, especially those from the far right who hate this deal and voted against it, even though it is supposed to bring us back, if it works out, all of our hostages from Gaza. And if only the first phase comes through, then 33 of those hostages, which I think, we should strive and work very hard to get everybody out of there and to get this deal implemented in full. But they voted against it, even though they think that just in the first phase, you could get 33 hostages. So to these people like Smotrich, who you mentioned, Netanyahu is saying this is a temporary ceasefire. We'll get however much hostages we can get, and then the war will be renewed. But to the hostage families at the same time, and most importantly, to President-elect Trump, he's been saying something different, that we're going to get all of the hostages back, that we're going to stand by this deal. And Ayman, if this deal is fully implemented, then Israel gets back all of the 98 hostages, and the war in Gaza is over. There is no place in this deal for the war to be renewed, unless, of course, Hamas does not honor the deal and does not release the hostages, which then, of course, you would have an overwhelming majority in Israel supporting the renewal of the war. But most Israelis, if you ask them today, should we go through with this deal, not just phase 1, but also phase 2 and 3, and end the war in return for the release of all the hostages? This has a clear majority in Israel. Problem is, the majority is not represented in the Netanyahu coalition, where you have strong minority that wants to continue the war.
Yeah, you answered actually the second question I was going to ask you about, which is the actual end of the war. If this deal does go completely through without any violations, you put the violations on the side, assuming that both parties commit to it, it means that Israel will have to accept that Hamas is still and has survived. And is that something this government in Israel is prepared to admit? Because they just entered into an agreement with Hamas. And by definition, if they commit and stay and release all of the 98 hostages, plus all of the bodies and everything, then at the end of it, Hamas has not been destroyed.
That's true, but Hamas will remain a terror organization according to all the international definitions. And I think that actually, if the war is over and the hostages are back, Israel will have a mandate internationally to apply a lot of pressure on Hamas, not militarily, not by renewing the war, but through other means, economic and diplomatic and other ways, to isolate Hamas, to pressure Hamas to give up power in Gaza and to be replaced by a different Palestinian government. And one of the key problems here throughout the last 15 months has been that Israel put out a clear goal for the war to end Hamas's rule over Gaza. But this specific Israeli government, for political reasons, has not presented a credible plan for what would happen in Gaza once Hamas is removed and who would replace Hamas. And there is, I think, an overwhelming consensus in the world today that Hamas is a terrible organization, a murderous organization that should not remain in power in Gaza and should be replaced. But the question is, what is the way to do it? Is another few months of war now in Gaza, during which many of our hostages could die, the way to achieve it, or a diplomatic plan supported by the United States, by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, with also, involvement of the Palestinian Authority and other regional actors. And this is something that you could actually implement much more effectively once the war is over.
Let me ask you if I can, Amir, and we're almost out of time, I apologize, but there was some question about this deal and the role that President Trump played and whether or not he used a lot of leverage against the prime minister. Others are saying the prime minister wanted to give him this win, knowing that there will be...
Prime Minister, Ayman, not against the prime minister, in favor of the hostages. He used a lot of leverage in favor of the hostages. He put pressure on Hamas, but also on Netanyahu, because he wants the hostages back home, and not just the 33 hostages of the first phase. This deal that President-elect Trump had a major role in getting, I give him the most credit of all the actors involved. It is a deal that is supposed to bring us back all the hostages and end the war. And yes, he applied leverage because that was the way to do it. That was the way. If he had not gotten involved, I don't think we would have had this deal right now. But it's important to remember, the deal is still not secure. There are still strong forces who want to try to make this deal fail. And we actually really need it to work so that we can get back all of our people. It's not against anybody. It's in favor of the hostages.
Thank you so much. That's exactly what I was going to ask you about how this is being perceived and how this deal is actually being perceived there in Israel with Donald Trump's role. Amir Tibon, thank you so much. It's good to see you. Always appreciate it. Thanks for staying up late for us.
Thank you for having me.